Here. I'm Laura Atkins, and I'm delighted to be here in this Zoom space, recording a keynote lecture. This is for the Belonging Begins With Me Family Engagement Symposium. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with educators and librarians, but also parents and anyone who's interested in learning about ways to diversify classroom libraries to increase a sense of belonging. And as you'll see, I'm going to talk especially about kind of grassroots, local, community-based children's book creation and how many great books there are out there. I wanted to offer special thanks or give my special thanks to Jamie Koo, who's really been the force in organizing this. She's the parent engagement coordinator. And then also Amanda Turkey, the coordinator of school library services, both in Santa Clara County Office of Education. So I am delighted to be here. And going along with this is organizing a book fair, which I'll talk more about, but that's happening as part of the symposium as well. So, I have to change my slides. So what's coming up in this talk, you might ask? I'm going to share some information about my background. I worked in publishing in various ways to kind of set the scene. I'm going to talk about how I have presented with co-authors and other people the first two books in the Fighting for Justice series, mostly to schools. And I am going to then shift the focus to grassroots community-based book publishing. And I'm going to provide, I hope, lots of resources that you can use to help you find these kinds of books. But first, I wanted to start off with this kind of concept, which Arisa White, she was the co-author with me on Biddy Mason Speaks Up, and she brought this to the table in our kind of approach to creating the book. And I found it such a powerful concept, so I wanted to bring it into this kind of lecture as a way to approach thinking about this topic. We use the idea of I am because we are, which is the Ubuntu. So it's a Southern African philosophy that roughly translates to I am because we are. And in this worldview, we actively participate in the well-being of the entire community. An individual is interdependent with others and cannot achieve anything alone. This is something I believe deeply. I feel very lucky and privileged to be part of a larger community, especially of children's book creators, but I think in every level for the health of our community and society, when we see ourselves interconnected in this way and our well-being connected with each other's well-being, then we treat each other better, we treat the earth better. So that's really underlying a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Oops, sorry. Okay. So I'm going to go back a little bit and talk about my childhood and what kind of developed my love of stories. I was a very avid reader. I read a lot of fairy tales and myths and legends, and then shifted more to fantasy. I was a big fantasy and science fiction fan in high school. So you can see some of the books that I read as a child here on the left. Fairy tales, myths. The Phantom Tollbooth was a huge influence for me. Kurt Vonnegut, I was a big lover of his books. The majority of what I read growing up was written by white authors. It was later when I was in college and studying as an English major that I started to be exposed to a more diverse range of voices, like Women Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston, Memory of Fire, Eduardo Galeano, and actually even only more recently that I fell hard for Octavia Butler and have read everything I can from her. And I think what I really love about these books is that they open up the sense of possibility, that we can imagine what the future is or might be or what we want it to be, and just even other possibilities. So that for me has been a kind of powerful part of what developed my sense and love of stories, which then drew me to getting into working in publishing. And what got me into publishing was a combination of loving books, being a really avid book reader, but also I was an activist, and you'll hear more about that later. So finding Children's Book Press in San Francisco felt like a perfect match. Children's Book Press was founded by Harriet Romer, and I think in '75, and it was a nonprofit publisher of multicultural and bilingual picture books for kids. It gave me an incredible kind of deep dive into the creation of children's books, but really outside of what I would later learn was kind of a more mainstream traditional capitalist publishing approach. So these books were mission driven. When I was there, it was to create books that all children will love and relate to or identify with. And some of the experiences I had were, say, working on I See the Rhythm, which was a picture book that covered 500 years of African American history, which seems kind of impossible and mind blowing. And these books were really created to respond to community needs. We would go to conferences and we'd hear from, say, librarians from the South San Francisco area who would say, we really need books that reflect Filipino American experiences, because we have so many kids from that background who don't get to see themselves in books. So there was this dynamic. There was also an educational outreach component program, a nonprofit part of this publisher that sent authors and books into schools. So this was where I kind of first got into the children's publishing world, which was an amazing way to learn and get immersed. So I was there from 94 to 98. And then I was at Orchard Books for a year, which was a kind of a medium-sized publisher. And then I went to Lee and Low Books, where I was an editor for 2 years. And Lee and Low still exists. They're kind of one of the main publishers of diverse picture books. After sort of shuffling around that's happened, that's really what they focus on. It was family run, I think still is. So a small publisher, not that many people who work there. It worked much more within the kind of New York publishing arena. So moving to New York, I was thinking I want to learn more about publishing. I'm passionate about creating children's books. It was different from Children's Book Press. It's a for-profit publisher. And my experience there was that the books that get published factored in kind of a larger sense of sort of what will, at least in my experience, like librarians in Kansas be able to tolerate. That's something that happened when we were developing the book Deshawn Days. And actually, I've written a paper about my experience of trying to edit that book and others and thinking about what kind of factors shape how books get produced. So in that case, there was a question of whether we mention crack files in a picture book, and how positive or negative the book kind of feels on balance. So I got to work on some books I'm so proud I worked on. You can see some of them here. And I got to help launch the New Voices Award, which is a award for a previously unpublished picture book, person who's written a picture book about a person of color, though that may have changed since I was there. I was there a long time ago. But for me, being at Lee and Low was sort of being immersed in a more New York mainstream publishing world that I found daunting and a little disturbing after having been at Children's Book Press, which felt so responsive to community needs, both by being a nonprofit and being so embedded in the community. Lee and Low felt to me like there was more effort given to reaching out to kind of influencers, important librarians, or kind of people with that kind of power. And just seeing the New York publishing, having friends in general, I got this sense of a system that is not very responsive and that tends to be New York centric. If a book is about California, it's seen as too regional, whereas New York is very much where everything happens. So for me, as a sort of radical activist from Berkeley, being in this very profit driven, where like a lot of publishers, not Lee and Low when I was there, but would have to have a profit and loss statement to decide if they were going to publish a book and decide, and yeah, it was just a very different kind of publishing space for me. So I left and ended up going into academics. I went and got a master's in children's literature in London, eventually an MFA and writing for children and young adults. But I also became a freelance editor starting in 2001. And I kind of put up my shingle with a website and started to work with a lot of individuals, but also some publishers who were looking for editorial feedback. So you can see here on the left are more some of the kind of independent published books that I worked on with either individuals or small publishers, people who wanted to just bring their books into the world to kind of differing degrees of how much they were sort of acting as publishers. Some of the publishers I worked with included Cassava Republic Press with Eno's Story. That's a Nigerian-based publisher. Blood Orange Press with One of a Kind Like Me. That's a Bay Area publisher. City Lights, I gave editorial consultation on the Rad Women A to Z book. I've edited like Mr. Packrat Really Wants That for Parallax Press, which such as Thich Nhat Hanh's publisher. And I've done a fair amount of work with Room to Read, which is actually an international literacy organization, but that publishes books internationally. And I project managed and edited a series of 10 books on climate change where the books were developed in 10 different countries with local teams. So this experience has really opened up my experience of, or mind, to what publishing can look like. And progressively over the years, self-publishing has become more and more of a viable option, or people setting up their own small publishers. And I found that shift super exciting because it feels really empowering. And the advice I give people shifts a lot. Choosing to set up a small publisher or publish just individual books. In that case, I feel like I can support people in really telling the stories they want to tell the way they want to tell it, and do my best to kind of meet them where they are, and also be sensitive, especially if I'm working with people from different backgrounds, about what their experiences are, what kind of ideas they have about storytelling. Because something that I learned in working in publishing was that, as I talked about my experience of learning to love stories, I was sort of stewed in a very particular idea of what stories are or how to tell stories. And I learned along the way that a lot of that, all of it really is culturally constructed. And a lot of the ideas that we have of what like a story should be, the 3-act structure, when things should happen, that it should feature one main character who's overcoming obstacles, all of these things have been created mostly in kind of Western storytelling traditions. And those can change depending on the construct. One short example, when I was at Lee and Low and put out a call looking for books by Native American authors, I got a book submitted by a published author for adults, and I rejected it saying we didn't publish fantasy. It was a book where a young boy develops a talking relationship with a rock. And she wrote back and said, in my culture, that isn't considered fantasy, which for me was a real moment to be self-reflective and think, wow, these ideas that I kind of hold as just truths are really constructed. And I really need to think about where that comes from. So that's kind of what got me into the publishing world. And where, as you saw, I wrote that article. I've written several articles, one of which I'll give later, thinking about what happens in terms of gatekeeping as books come through the publishing system, especially the traditional system. What gets chosen, what doesn't. Once something is chosen, how is it edited? Who's considered to be the audience? I became more and more aware of the impacts of all of that. The other thing that happened is I got a master's in children's literature and then a master's of fine arts in children's literature at Vermont College of Fine Arts. The first one was in London at Roehampton University. And that kind of helped me shift into writing as well as editing. So now I do both. And as a writer, I wrote Sled Dog Dachshund, a picture book about a dachshund who's sure he can win a sled race. And I also got to co-write the first 2 books in the Fighting for Justice series. Fred Korematsu Speaks Up with Stan Yogi, and Biddy Mason Speaks Up with Arisa White. And what I'm going to do now is share a bit about how these books came to be, and then how we've shared those books in school presentations. But before I do that, a quick ode to educators and honoring parents as well. But right now, to be an educator, sharing books, especially these kind of books with kids, is so important, and it's under challenge. So I just wanted to say, you all, educators and other people connected to children, you are helping to bring young people's stories so they can make sense of their own lives, and then also better understand how they fit into our larger society. And it is so important to provide them with a deep diversity of stories, including those that reflect our nation's real histories. That's just under attack right now. As some are trying to keep these stories out of kids' hands, we need to make sure that they are available. So thank you for all that you do to make this happen. And this idea will link also later when I start to talk about the diversity of voices that I feel very excited to see, even in just the Bay Area, indie children's book world. So origin story for the Fighting for Justice series is that Stan Yogi, who I co-wrote the first book with, along with Elaine Ellenson, co-wrote this book called Wherever There's a Fight: How Runaway Slaves, Suffragists, Immigrants, Strikers, and Poets Shaped Civil Liberties in California. This book came to be because Malcolm Margolin, who you see on the right, was the founder and publisher at Heyday Books in Berkeley, another nonprofit publisher that publishes books that are kind of specific to California, and often have civil rights or activist lens, also nature, ecology, and native California books. And after September 11th, Stan and Malcolm were in conversation about how civil liberties were being infringed and taken back, and how important it was for people to understand who fought and how they fought for these civil liberties in the first place. When that book was done, Malcolm said to Stan, wouldn't it be great if there was a book for kids like this, or a series for kids? Stan said yes, and I started to work on this originally as one book and then as a series, and was working at the time on the Fred Korematsu book, writing it as sort of a traditional prose biography, just sort of chapter books, and struggling to kind of make it really work for a young audience who he had not worked for before. What I got involved is that I was speaking on a panel at the ACL Institute in 2015. I think it's the Association of Children's Librarians. The theme was diversity. And note Maya Gonzalez here, who actually I first met at Children's Book Press. She's going to come in later. Anyway, I was talking about diversity, and Molly Woodward, the editor from Heyday, who was working on the book with Stan, approached me and asked if I would consider coming on board, which I did, which ultimately led to Stan and I writing the book together. So part of what I brought to the table was a format proposal that was a bit different. If we were going to write these books about people who have fought for civil rights in California history, I wondered, if we're talking about activism, how to not make it just focus on one kind of exceptional individual, and have the scope to look more broadly at community and activism, and also to make it engaging for kids. And go against the worry that maybe this is going to feel like a too serious and boring book for kids, like we're trying to teach them a lesson. So the format includes, and you can see here, we have illustrations by an illustrator that frame each chapter. The main chapters are biography in verse and sort of free verse, short lines, accessible, especially for reluctant readers. And then we have these sections, which we called insets, that follow each chapter and that develop on the theme of that chapter. And there we can tell other people's stories. We can include artwork and newspaper articles and a timeline. We include timelines that are kind of related to that topic. We also have definitions of words that we use. And this gave us kind of a chance to address these goals that we sort of developed, which is that we wanted the readers to feel empathy for the person whose story we were telling. We wanted them to be educated about that person, but also about what was happening at the time, and specifically about understanding our rights as citizens and the history of discrimination and how people, citizens and others, have fought for justice. We wanted to engage readers so they look at their own contexts and be alert for discrimination, and also empower them. So by asking them questions and showing them the story, get them to think, like, what can I do? How can I take action? And finally, we wanted to make sure we were entertaining them as well. We did not want the books to be boring. And luckily, the feedback we've had is mostly that the books are not boring. So that's great, that they're exciting and engaging. And so Stan and I have been presenting this book to schools up till COVID. We did a lot of presentations to over 8,000 students at over 50 schools. We were in California, Washington, New York, and Chicago. The ACLU of Northern California donated copies of actually this book and Biddy Mason Speaks Up to every middle school library in California. Not in the California, sorry about that. And as you can see, the book won several awards and has gotten a fair amount of attention. This is a picture of us presenting the book at Glenview Elementary School in Oakland. So now I'm going to very kind of briefly run through how Stan and I do our presentation, and then I'll talk about the second book. So at the beginning of the presentation, Stan will show this picture and ask students, who do you think this is? Several guesses, but in fact, some will guess Fred Korematsu. No, it's Stan. And Stan will say, yeah, that's me. When I was 10 years old, about the age of many of the kids that we're presenting to. And he says, when I was your age, I liked to play basketball. I played the piano. He wanted to be a roller derby person. But he said, when I was 10, I also learned something important that had happened to my family. And he says to the students, what do you think is happening here? They raise their hands. Yes, she's graduating. And he says, yes, this is my mother. And this is her high school graduation, but she didn't graduate from any normal high school like you all are going to. She graduated from high school in a prison camp in the California desert. Why do you think that was? And there's usually a student or two, if they haven't already read the book, who knows about World War II and what happened to Japanese Americans during that time. And Stan said, yes, my mother, my father, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents all were imprisoned in the desert, even though they had done nothing wrong. And then he says that for him, helping to tell Fred Korematsu's story that's his connection to telling the story. And then I say I was raised in a family of activists. So on the left, that's my father at a protest against the Vietnam War in Kezar Stadium in San Francisco with thousands of people. And then my mother and her now wife, Jan, use singing as a way to protest. And this is them. They were part of a singing group that were at a protest for women's rights. And that as a result, I became a young activist myself. So that's me in the 7th grade. This picture on the left, I was in middle school in 7th grade in an anti-nuclear group. And on the right, this was when I was in high school, still protesting the development of nuclear weapons, and that we blockaded Lawrence Livermore Labs and got me there. And that it got written up in the newspaper. And that the second paragraph says, the demonstration resulted in the arrests of 65 protesters, 10 of whom were Berkeley High School students. So that for me, I learned that as a young person, you can speak up and sometimes you can make a difference and sometimes grownups will listen. After that, we read the first poem of the book, Getting a Haircut, which tells how Fred Korematsu went to get a haircut and was told, we don't cut hair of your kind. Why? Because he was Japanese American and this barbershop discriminated against people who looked like him. And so he walked down the street to a barbershop in Chinatown where he could get his hair cut like his friends. So I start by reading that poem, and then Stan talks about the inset that we have following this, which looks at discrimination, but like historically different kinds of discrimination, different groups who have faced discrimination in our country. So Irish Americans, immigrants from China, Mexican Americans or Latina Americans, but then also he zooms in a little bit to the civil rights movement and sort of separate but equal, but really unequal idea. So this is a chance for us to get kids thinking about not just Fred's story, but discrimination and how it works on a larger level. Then we go on to tell Fred's story that he and his girlfriend Ida were listening to the radio of their car, sitting and looking out at the bay when they heard that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, and how upset his parents were, and that soon after FDR brought the United States into World War II. And then we talk about how people were told they had a very short amount of time to prepare and go to these prison camps. And Stan will ask the kids, if you had just 5 days to pack and take only what you can carry, what would you bring? Engages kids to really think about that, ask them what they think this number is, and that, yes, it's the family number that people got, and they were supposed to put it on their luggage, but you can see they also put it on this little girl, like she's a piece of property and not a human being. We then tell, and I read from the poem where Fred ends up getting arrested because he doesn't go to the camps. He's trying to stay with his girlfriend, and how Ernest Bessig, who's a lawyer from the ACLU of Northern California, approaches him and asks if he'll use his case to fight the legality of incarcerating what will become 120,000 Japanese Americans, from babies in orphanages to senior citizens in old age homes, even though there's no proof that they've done anything wrong. And Fred says yes and agrees. From that point, he goes first to a camp that's in San Bruno, and then he ends up, and they're all transferred to Topaz in the desert. And Fred Korematsu's case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which decided at the time that it was a military necessity to incarcerate 120,000 people. And so as a result, Fred's case, he was found guilty effectively. And in the Supreme Court, it justified the incarceration of Japanese American people. And then after that, Fred Korematsu married his wife, Catherine. They had kids. He struggled because he had this criminal conviction. So there were certain kinds of jobs that he couldn't get. And he spent years, he and Catherine, hoping there would be an opportunity to challenge or reopen his case. And then 40 years later, another lawyer found evidence at the National Archives, and that's what this card in the middle shows, that the government had lied to the Supreme Court during that 1944 case. And they had said they had proof that Japanese Americans were sending signals to ships, Japanese ships. And in fact, all the evidence they had showed that Japanese Americans were loyal, and they misrepresented that. And so based on that, Fred Korematsu was able to reopen his case. And you can see he had a predominantly Japanese American pro bono team of lawyers. And it went to federal court in San Francisco, and the judge invited Fred Korematsu to make a statement before she gave the ruling. And part of what he said, and we share this with kids, was, as long as my record stands in federal court, any American citizen can be held in prison or concentration camp without a trial or hearing. That is, if they look like the enemy of this country. Therefore, I would like to see the government admit that they were wrong and do something about it, so this will never happen again to any American citizen of any race, creed, or color. And then after he gave that statement, the judge decided, the federal judge decided that he was right, that he had been incorrectly found guilty, and his case was overturned. His particular conviction was overturned. And after that, he became an activist, and in his around about discrimination. And after 9/11, he signed on to an amicus brief, which supported people who were being held without trial in Guantanamo Bay. So Stan and I will address that at a slightly lower level when we're talking to kids. And Stan tells a story of how Fred loved to talk to students, and one of those students was him when he was at UCLA as a student, and how watching Fred up there, who wasn't a big man, he wasn't a loud man or a big personality, and Stan's not a big man or a tall man or a loud personality. He said, Fred could have just been one of his uncles, but he taught Stan that he could stand up for what he believed in, and that had really become a kind of guiding, kind of purpose for Stan. Then we share a picture that we update as time goes on of different movements that are taking place where young people are, visibly taking part. So the climate emergency, defending the rights of immigrants and dreamers, fighting against Asian American hate, the Black Lives Matter movement, and fighting for gun control. These are all movements where we see young people taking to the streets. But we say, you don't just have to take to the streets and protest. You can do, it's up to each of us to find ways that make sense for us to speak up. So for me and Stan, writing this book, for the artists that we work with, they could use their artwork to speak up for justice. My mother and her wife are still using music. They're involved in the La Peña community chorus, so they still sing as a way of speaking up. So it's really up to all of us to find our way. And at the end, we'll ask kids, how can you be like Fred and speak up for what you think is right? And over the years that we've been presenting this book, it came out in 2017, we've had a few interactions I wanted to quickly share that have been very powerful, that are about how young people are speaking up, that we've learned. So when we were presenting actually at the Fred Korematsu Elementary School that's in Davis, California, and it's the first school that was named for Fred Korematsu, there's a few of them. We had these three students, Jana, Mona, and Batul, approach us afterwards, and they shared with me and Stan a disturbing story, which is that their mosque had been vandalized. But they came to their community, and the school ended up organizing a fundraiser to help support and with the repairs of the mosque. And they were really proud to tell us that story. It clearly meant a lot to them. On the right, you can see us with Lisa Bishop, who's the librarian of Bishop Middle School in San Francisco. And she showed us and told us the story that she has typewriters that she keeps in the library, and that during the election in which Trump would ultimately get elected, she invited students to write letters and send them. And when she had one girl kind of who wrote a letter to then nominee Trump, she said, we're going to photocopy this, we're going to keep it, we're going to file it away, because what you're doing, this is part of history. So getting to meet these teachers and librarians has been very inspiring. This was when we presented to the third graders at Phoebe Diamond's class at Chabot Elementary in Oakland. And after we presented to the whole, school, Phoebe Diamond asked us, with her students' excitement, if we would come and see a display that they had made outside of their classroom, again, soon after the election, where they made the decision to draw pictures of people and say what they stand up for. So this has been, a very exciting, healing process, I think, for Stan and I to be sharing the story and then connect with people who are doing such important work, especially educators and kids. I wanted to highlight the Fred Korematsu Institute, which is run by Karen Korematsu, Fred's daughter. And she has fought hard to get Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties and the Constitution recognized in several states. They also offer this educational toolkit that includes a teacher's guide that goes along with our book, which includes also some excerpts from the book, but also curriculum. There's a great documentary that really informed Stan and my writing of the book. So any educator can get this for free just following this website. So after the Fred Korematsu book came out, the plan was for Stan and I to keep co-writing this series, and the people had been selected who we were going to be featuring. Stan in the end said he would like to pass the baton, that for him it was a huge amount of work. He said he felt like he had to have a PhD in each subject, which was partially my fault because this format meant you had to really do a lot of research in a lot of different ways, not just on the person, but on broader kind of aspects of the story. He said he also wasn't an aspiring children's book author. So at the time, Heyday Books asked if I would like to write the next book in the series, which is Biddy Mason Speaks Up, which is about an enslaved woman, and I'll tell more about her story. And the community and with myself, I really didn't feel comfortable as a white woman writing that book by myself. And so I went back to Heyday and proposed the idea that we find a different co-author for the book whose background represented the story that we were telling, which they were open to. And so after a short kind of search, we found, and she said yes, Arisa White, who at the time was living in Oakland. She's now in Colby College, Maine, teaching poetry. So she and I worked together on the story of Biddy Mason, and you can get a little bit of a taste of like what it's like for us working on this Google Doc with us putting comments, and also Molly Woodward, who was the editor. This book also was an award-winning book. I'll tell you a little bit more about what's in the story, and then also the way we found after Arisa left to present this book in schools, though briefly. So I want to start by reading the introduction to this book, because actually I think this is really kind of a theme for all of the books. Here's one of the questions we ask readers: what is history, and why do we tell stories? The record we call history does not tell everyone's story. We faced this challenge when we decided to write about Biddy Mason. She was held captive and enslaved along with millions of Black people in our country. People in power did not allow her or most enslaved people to learn to read or write. Enslaved people's stories were rarely recorded or valued by the white people who kept records, the records that became our nation's history. Writing this book was a creative act of repairing the historical record, of imagining Biddy Mason's life based on all the information and stories we could gather. We believe that we are all better when we hear everyone's stories, especially those that have been silenced. This is not the story of a single person doing a single heroic act. It is the story of collective effort. Biddy used plants and healing to fulfill her dreams of freedom and home ownership with the support of women helping women, free Black people helping enslaved Black people, and a network that extended across states and races. Now more than ever, we need to understand that we do not do anything alone. We are interconnected. As Biddy Mason said, nothing good can come into a closed hand. So this sort of expresses for Arisa and I think the approach to this book of telling a story that is not just one person's story, and the collective effort that was required and continues to be required to make great change. So this follows the same format. This is the first poem that Arisa wrote that starts with young Biddy and her Granny Ellen. In this case, as we said in that introduction, we really had to make up a story for Biddy. There's very little known about her because what the period of time we're talking about is longer ago than World War II, and because of the fact that these stories often weren't preserved. So we did our best to be really transparent about what we were making up and what our sources are. In this case, we know that Biddy Mason went on to become she was a midwife. She would have known plant medicine. She became a doctor's assistant. And so here, Arisa, who took the lead on writing the poems, brought in the idea that she had this Granny Ellen who would have taught her this kind of plant medicine. And we include these little features, which you can see, of healing that could be done with different types of plant medicine that Biddy would have known and encountered. And what we tried to do, and this is in the back matter, is give a lot of resources for educators and for students, to figure out where we got our information that informed the writing and the stories that we told. So you can see here we have the key texts that provided information for us, and some of them are online. So young people, teachers can go on, and some of them are primary sources, so that are from the time. Some are secondary that were later. We also have a list of online resources completely online resources that educators and students can use. But additionally, we list the particular kind of influences from particular pages and stanzas so that people can see, oh, where did you get your information, and go and look into it themselves. And this is an example of the inset that follows that first poem. Here we really made an effort to talk about slavery, using definitions for us, for instance, why we use the word enslaved, which is on the previous word, rather than slave, helps to explain not just the language and defining it, but kind of the ideology behind it. And we try to do our best to unpick the idea of race as a made-up concept, how it came about, and get young people to think about power and different kinds of power. So we try again to cover a lot of ground with this topic, where there's a lot of ground to cover. At the end of the book, we feature Regina on the right, a modern-day abolitionist. She, up until I think last year, was based in Oakland and is a theater artist who also had been trafficked herself, was a survivor, and ran programs to support young women today who are being trafficked, and through creativity and resilience. And she found the Biddy Mason story to be, she spoke at our book launch, and actually there's a video of her speech, I'm pretty sure, at our book launch, which was incredibly powerful. How for her, as someone who was working with girls who are still facing, the same issues of basically being enslaved and trafficked, how reading Biddy Mason's story for her was, like she said, like a tall glass of water. And after the book came out and Arisa moved to Maine, and I felt like I didn't know how we could present this book, again, because I didn't feel comfortable as a white woman presenting it by myself. I approached Regina and she agreed, and we created a presentation together. And actually, as a theater artist, what she did was she created a Biddy Mason costume and wrote her own kind of parallel narrative so I would talk about the book's creation and she would talk about the main themes for her embodying Biddy Mason. And there's a video of this that you can watch that's on the Fighting for Justice series website. So for instance, she came up with these 5 main themes: freedom, hope, resilience, faith, and the truth of you. So here, just talking about resilience, we talked about the period when Biddy Mason and her children had to walk effectively across the country because the enslaving family that came from the South ended up in Salt Lake City because they were Mormons. And you can see her and her 3 children here. And she's telling stories about an encounter she has with a Potawatomi woman where they share kind of plant medicine information. And we asked this question: what are the migration stories of your family? So Arisa would enact Biddy Mason talking about this long walk and the resilience required. And then I would talk about how long this walk was, even just 1,000 miles to get to winter quarters, which you can see here, which is not even all the way to the Great Salt Lake, and asking kids, how far have you walked, to just get to think about, embodied what was required in this journey. And then we could expand and talk about things like what were popular occupations held by free Black women before the Civil War, or Jane Elizabeth Manning, who was a free Black woman previously enslaved, I'm pretty sure, who came with kind of the early Mormon kind of group, one of the first Black people. And we feature her. Arisa gave her a little kind of story based on what we know about her in the poems. So again, it's sort of this opportunity to think about what do we know, who are real people that we know more about, and how to incorporate them into the story. With Faith, we talk about how they had another trek across the Mojave Desert to get to California, San Bernardino, and again can talk about different real people who we have information about, like Elizabeth Lizzie Flake Rowan, who were part of this community. And I could share that for us writing this story, that this was a real community effort too, a real takes a village effort. And I talk about all of these different people who we shared the story with and got feedback from, like Blake Norton, who is the activist and curator from the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Cultural Center, who really helped us with the section where she encounters this Potawatomi woman. It turned out the picture we had of the plant was not accurate. And he told us, with the image, you should use this drawing rather than this photograph. Because this drawing is more accurate and feels more respectful. Sharia Mosley was an amazing PhD student who had worked with Ebony Thomas, who is a scholar who's focused on the representations of slavery in children's books. And she gave Aris and I incredible insight into, how we even used language when we were talking about Biddy's story and where we might be centering whiteness. So, both of us had a lot to learn. Taria Smith read and gave us feedback on any representation we had of Native Californians. Susan Anderson, who actually now, she was at the California Historical Society. She's now at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. And she gave us really invaluable feedback on Biddy Mason's story and how we were telling it. Molly Woodward, I've already mentioned, is our editor. Abdi Sultani, the executive director of the ACLU of Northern California, has been an incredible supporter of both of these books. And he gave us more kind of legal feedback on the kinds of legal stories that we were telling. And he encouraged us to include, which we did, where we talk about legal injustice. And even though California was brought in as a slave state, because Biddy and her children, who were still kept captive when they were in the enslaving family brought them to Camp San Bernardino, California, even though California was technically a free state, they were still held captive for 5 years. And for most people, you couldn't testify in court against a white person if you were not white. There was a lot to stop that kind of free state, edict to actually have been enforced. But also we talk about, and you can see the picture here, that California Indians, native people in California, were legally enslaved as well, which is something I didn't know until I was working on this book. I learned a lot working on both of these books. And that children would be taken from their families, kidnapped, and then could be indentured servants. So, part of the process of working on these books was learning this incredible history in our state of California, where I grew up, mostly learning about, the South is the place where these terrible things happened. Slavery and racism, and found we had segregated schools in California. We had segregated streetcars. We had legally enslaved indigenous people. Black people were still held captive while they were here. Biddy Mason was a lucky one because she was able, in large part through the support of the community and people around her, to challenge her enslavement in court, which that judge gave her legal freedom. So then she actually went on to become a nurse's assistant, a doctor's assistant. She lived in early Los Angeles. She was really a well-known figure, and she actually bought property and saved money and became one of the wealthiest women in Los Angeles. And so when Regina would enact Biddy Mason at this, her topic or theme for that was the truth of you, finding your own truth. And Biddy Mason bought property in what became downtown Los Angeles. You can see this was where her homestead was, but we also talk about how she established a daycare center for working families. She helped establish the first AME church and paid the minister's salary and taxes. People would come and ask her for money. So she became a philanthropist and community activist. So that gave us an opportunity again to talk about access to education and segregation in California schools at the time. So we could use Biddy Mason's story not only to honor her and her life, but also look at larger issues around the story that we were telling. And at the end of the book, we can highlight this picture here is of a monument, actually pictures on both sides, that is Biddy Mason Park between Broadway and Spring Street at 3rd Street. And this is a little tucked away. You have to kind of find it in Los Angeles. And this is at the opening, and these are her descendants. So her great-granddaughter Gladys, and then her great-great-granddaughter Linda, and her great-great-great-granddaughters Robin and Cheryl were there when this was unveiled. So Regina and I presented the book a few times. Then Regina has now moved to New York and COVID happened when all the kind of school visits dried up. But one thing that came out of the project that's been really was a wonderful experience and resource is, and important, especially as what I talked about earlier, where we have so many more people challenging across the country the kind of history children are able to learn, with the idea that white children shouldn't feel uncomfortable or feel bad about themselves. And so instead, they actually just shouldn't learn the real history of what happened in our country and in our state. So the ACLU of Northern California, I participated in this project of developing this resource called Gold Chains, The Hidden History of Slavery in California. And part of the resource has a feature of Biddy Mason and a video, and the video is based on our book. So they also have a podcast. They've been doing a lot of work and representation around reparations in California. So this is an incredible resource. I think for teachers and students, it doesn't just tell Biddy Mason stories. It tells stories of a lot of different people and kind of things that were happening around California's establishment and history and what slavery in California looked like. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears from talking about those two books and how me and my co-authors and Regina have been sharing them with schools. And like I said, they came out of Heyday Books in Berkeley, nonprofit publisher, does kind of regional, what would be seen as sort of regional books. And through that, I've gotten to meet some people I already knew from my children's book press days and earlier, a lot of people that I've met more recently, and become part of this community of people who are creating books for themselves and their communities in the way that they want to tell their stories. And there are incredible books. So I'm hoping in this last part of this presentation to share some of these creators and their creations and get you excited about finding their books. And especially if you're a parent or a caregiver and you've got kids, these are great books to share. And if you're a librarian or a teacher and you want to bring books into your classrooms that really reflect the communities, in a more like from the ground grassroots way, I think you'll find some incredible books and resources here. And this is just a little taste, but I'll talk more about some of these. But it's part of what I want to go a little deeper into why it's important to think about this. And what I said earlier about publishing and my experience working in publishing, we're going to get a little more data driven about this. So let's just look at some statistics. These are not, last year, but they're recent. So the Cooperative Children's Book Center School of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison every year does a roundup and creates these statistics of books by and about BIPOC creators. And you can see here from 2018, and this is a graphic that was created by Sarah Park-Dahlen and others to kind of really bring it to life so you can see it. And there's the infographic link here. And where I post this video, I will also be sharing links and resources so you can get them. But you can see in 2018, 1% of books were by or about American Indians, First Nations, 5% by Latinx, 7% Asian Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific American, 10% African or African American, 27% animals or other objects, and 50% white. And you can see in the picture, the white kid gets to see himself reflected all over the place, and these other kids get smaller and smaller kind of opportunities to see themselves and their experiences reflected. Maya and Matthew, I'm going to talk about in more detail around Reflection Press, and they had done these statistics looking at to be equal with white Americans, what would, BIPOC and Indigenous authors, if they were to tell their own stories, how many more books you'd need for them to have parity with their demographics. And they also look closer at the LGBTQI community and how many books were written by and written about. I think in this, they said that out of 3,700 books received in 2017, 134 had LGBTQ plus content, and only 21 were written by LGBTQ plus people. So these are important issues to think about. Why? One is the Lee and Low Diversity in Publishing. They do a baseline survey. This is from 2019, and it shows who works in the industry, including agents, but also working in publishing. So 76% white, 74% cis women, 81% straight, 89% non-disabled. And with this kind of even cis women category, what in my experience often happened is that there was a predominance at lower levels of female or female identifying people, but that as you got higher up, it tended to get more male or male presenting. I wrote an essay called A Fine Mess of Dessert and Time to Do Better, Thoughts on Engaging with Whiteness and White Supremacy in Publishing. So if you wanted to read more, and I go on and on pretty deep about kind of my take on this, there's a link here that will tell you to do it. But one of the issues that I talk about there that has been part of my learning is thinking about white privilege and the impact of white privilege. And this is a quote that I include in my essay that says, the white privilege discussion can be challenging, but it's crucial. There are tools such as Peggy McIntosh's foundational essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And that's where I first encountered it too, where she starts to reflect on how she can live her life unencumbered easily because of the color of her skin, white skin privilege. But this article by Corey Collins, What is White Privilege Really? Oh, this is a quote from my essay, goes deeper and brings this idea more towards the present day. He writes, McIntosh asked herself an important question that inspired her famous essay. On a daily basis, what do I have that I didn't earn? Our work should include, this is Corey Collins who says, our work should include asking the two looming follow-up questions. Who built that system and who keeps it going? Right? So thinking about who works in publishing, who's choosing what kind of books get published, with what kind of eye, getting back to like how I learned storytelling, if you put that on a huge scale, but also think about who has power and what are they trying to do with that power. If you think of publishing as predominantly most of the publishers functioning in a very capitalist, profit-driven model, which is also very centralized in New York, in every way. And then there's distribution. I mean, the way publishing works and how books get from where they start to where they finish. There are a lot of people in the middle with a lot of different interests and a lot of different expectations of who readers are. So with all of that in mind, I want to start showing you some of the alternatives. I'm going to start with, I think, who I would put as like one of the top examples of people who are pushing back against some of these systems of power that keep voices out. Zetta Elliott. I met Zetta when I was at Lee and Low. She submitted books. We didn't end up working together, but we met and became very close friends. And Zetta is one of the people I respect most in the world. She, on her website, has not just books that she self-publishes, but some are published with larger publishers as well. But she has essays, and her essays are fantastic. She uses magic and fantasy as a means to investigate and interrogate power and systems of power. And, she tells fantastic stories fearlessly. I've got one of her latest pictures here, Chicken Wonders Why, is a direct response to book banning. And there's a barnyard where the animals get read to sleep every night by the very white farmers, I think they're Dick and Jane, the farmer and his wife, who then go out of town, and the animals are starting to tell their own stories. And they start to think, wait, how do these stories happen? And why are they supposed to be a certain way? And Chicken keeps wondering why. And it's just a brilliant kind of getting you to think about like who tells stories and why, but in this sort of using this method. Anyway, you have to read it. It's a great book. And you can see some of her other books here. So like The War on the Witches is part of her Dragons in a Bag series, which is being published by Random House. And at the same time, Blue Boy is a book based on her trips to Scotland that she's self-publishing. So she has created, I think she's self-published over 40 books and also had lots of book published. So she sort of works both systems, and she never compromises her integrity or her sense of the kinds of stories she wants to tell, which is very tricky in especially the traditional publishing world. So she has really been a role model for me and an inspiration. So the other example I'm going to talk about in a fair amount of detail is the Social Justice Book Fair, or the Social Justice Children's Book Holiday Fair. This last year, this was in 2022, we had our 6th annual Social Justice Children's Book Fair. There's a group of us that have been voluntarily organizing this fair, and the current team you can see up here. There's Rob Trujillo, me, Alejandra Domensain, Janine Macbeth, Peter Lamata, and Lydia, his partner, who's, I think Yamagachi is her last name. And you can see here, like just a snapshot of some of the beautiful photos that were taken, I think a lot by Janine Macbeth, from our latest book fair, where we kind of barely escaped from downpours and were able to still do an outdoor event. So you can see the kind of amazing array of people and faces and stories that are people who are included. And we basically invite people who see themselves and self-identify as fitting into the social justice children's book kind of theme, and then find a place, and people just set up tables and sell their books. So there's no charge or a small charge if we have something we have to pay for it. And it's a way for families and community members to come and find out about books that people are self-publishing or who have small publishers. So Mr. Lamata, Peter Lamata, who you can see here, who has a story time with Mr. Lamata. He actually reads picture books, or sometimes older books, but mostly picture books, 5 days a week, every day. And you can see them on Facebook or YouTube. And yeah, he's just this incredible force. And he's actually going to be with me. I'm recording this Friday, tomorrow, when we're going to be selling books from Social Justice Book Fair participants at the Educational Symposium. So he's a real activist and friend of children. I also wanted to kind of pull out Reflection Press, or Gender Wheel, which is an imprint of Reflection Press, which is run by Maya Gonzalez and Matthew Smith. So they have their latest book that is on sale now, going to come out soon, is the Gender and Infinity book for kids, that connects nature and goes a kind of alternative to the sort of binary thinking that we get imposed upon us, for kids to really understand the sort of infinite options of experience and expression of gender and identity. And part of why I'm wanting to really pull out Maya and Matthew is because they run this publisher, Reflection Press. It's run by two people. It's a Latinx, queer, trans-owned publisher based in San Francisco. They produce fantastic books and other materials for kids that are really affirming and beautiful, and nature-based for kids and caregivers to think about gender with kids. And their book, They, She, He, as easy as ABC, which is sort of playing with pronouns, was one of the most banned picture books from the 2022 school year. You can see it was tied for number 8. And since that happened, they're a small publisher. Most of the books on that list, if not all of the other books, are from big publishers where they have a large list and can kind of, take that hit. Some people say, oh, if your books are banned, great, it brings you more attention. For Maya and Matthew, it has meant between 1/3 and 1/2 drop in their book sales, because educators and people across the country are afraid to stock these books. It is having a direct impact on their livelihood. So part of why I'm showing this is to say how important it is. If we spend our money and we put our money into buying books, it's not just that we're providing wonderful materials for kids, which they deserve, but it's also we wanting to support with our money. People like Maya and Matthew are doing the work in a really beautiful way. And if we don't support it, we're going to lose it. I just wanted to call out actually that they're going to be doing a training series in Santa Clara County that's going to be taking place in September, late September, very soon. If you're in Santa Clara County, I think if you're connected to the education establishment, then you could sign up for these series. But if you aren't, the wonderful thing is that they have online self-guided gender training and also in-person facilitation that you can hire them for. I highly, highly recommend the video series, which is a great way to learn about history with LGBTQT+ people, the connection to nature, and kind of broader issues around gender. You will not regret it, I promise. So I just wanted to quickly kind of close out by just highlighting some of the other social justice book fair people, many of whose books will be available for sale tomorrow. But you can find them through the links that are right here. So I've done Zeta already. Janine Macbeth, who was one of the co-founders of the Social Justice Book Fair, runs Blood Orange Press. This is her beautiful book, Oh, Oh, Baby Boy. I mentioned Maya and Matthew already. Jill Guerra Berger runs the Love Curriculum, and she has all these beautiful books on mindfulness and yoga. This one, When I Breathe Deeply, features pictures of kids in Oakland reflecting on what happens for them when they breathe deeply. Rob Trujillo is one of the other co-founders and volunteers who runs the book fair. This is his first book that he self-published for Quan's First Flat Top, and he's gone on to publish several books. His latest one, Fresh Juice, is with Lee and Low Books. Justine Villanueva runs Sagawa River Press. They're all Filipino-American picture books, themed picture books. Inosanto Nagara, one of the other co-founders of the book fair. His book, you will probably know, A is for Activist. He also has My Night in the Planetarium and many, many other books that are really about activism and helping kids feel empowered to speak up. Alejandra Domensain is now one of the other volunteer organizers of the Social Justice Book Fair. Her book, For All Para Todos, bilingual kind of parable around undocumented immigration and standing up, speaking up for your rights. Angela Dalton, To Boldly Go, is a picture book biography of Nichelle Nichols. She self-published her first picture book. She sort of danced in both places. Karen Chan with Glue Books is a small publisher based in LA, has this very Asian guide series of books for different kinds of Asian food. The Hard Worker, a book that I found at one of our first social justice book fairs, which to me is like the embodiment of how these indie published titles don't necessarily look like. People might say, oh, this doesn't fit a picture book format. It's longer than you'd expect, the illustration style. This is an own voices book about an unhoused person. A child supports an unhoused man who's collecting cans and gets harassed by the police. And together they find a way to find a store that will help them set up a recycling center. It's an incredible book. And I think it's the kind of book that people would initially, first of all, it would be hard to find. And second of all, people might put away because they'd say, oh, aesthetically, this isn't what I expect. And so I would ask you to kind of question yourself and the kind of aesthetic expectations you have to think about what kinds of stories are you bringing to kids. Ko Kim wrote We Are Gems, Healing from Anti-Asian Microaggressions Through Self-Love and Solidarity. She's a South Bay wonderful author. Lourdes Rivera is a non-binary teacher in the Berkeley school system who wrote this book, Call Me Mix, Me Llamen Maestre, about being non-binary and their experience growing up, that I think is one of the best expressions I've seen, or books that I've seen, to help people understand what does it mean to be non-binary. Koja and Angel Adeyoja, this is a Two Spirits book published by Flamingo Rampant that does a whole bunch of books that are kind of queer themed. Journey for Justice, the life of Larry Itliong, a picture book biography of Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino-American farm worker who really fought the Filipino-American farm workers alongside Cesar Chavez and the Latinx American farm workers. Anne Burlick wrote Pueblito's Big Decision. This is a union book dealing with a child who's whether to cross a picket line or not. Haley with If You Give a Girl a Bike, really fun, dynamic pictures showing girls kind of engaging in physical activities that sometimes aren't always associated with girls, and especially girls who aren't white. Archa Srivastav wrote this series of little feminist books, We Are Little Feminist board books, which includes one of the only pictures I've seen showing a trans dad. Angelo Monsalve Restrepo, and I might have misspelled his middle name, if so, sorry, has Screen Time, a precautionary cell phone tale, talking about screen time for kids. And he's actually going to be there in person selling books tomorrow at the fair. Christina Newhard runs her own publisher of all Filipino American stories. This one, Amina and the City of Flowers, a Chavacano tale, is a beautiful book. Khalid White runs Black Empower Books, and he has this bilingual book, Hermanito, Little Brother, available, and other books at blackempower.com. I'm pretty sure other books. Kamaria Lofton has this Kids Love Oakland, My City is Oakland book, and other books that are so fun, featuring sites in Oakland. John Castleberry and Madeline Connor have Courageous Adventures of the Conscious Kids. This is more of a middle grade book featuring this multicultural group of kids, and also featuring a lot of art and artists. Grace Carroll has Akira's Animal Alphabet Alliterations, and she has a book club with several books in the series. So that's just a taste, right? That's just a taste of the Social Justice Book Fair. And the website for the Social Justice Book Fair is at the end of this, and I'll also have it as a resource. So you can go and find all of these people and find links to all of their books. I wanted to say at the end, I've also in the process of launching this Manzanita children's book community, which is going to be a space to support creators of grassroots community-based children's books, so people can support each other and share information and what they've learned and resources, where people can come and find, oh, I want to find an editor, I want to find an illustrator, that this will be a place where you can find people like that. And I'm going to be running classes. I'm working on developing a class that I think I'm going to launch in October of this year, which is 2023, to kind of support people in working on your story, your picture book story, and then figuring out your next steps, your publishing steps, but with a focus and emphasis on people who are thinking of indie publishing or self-publishing, or possibly going with small kind of micro publishers. Last resource I'm going to throw at you that's a great resource if you're looking not just for kind of traditionally published books is Social Justice Books, which has book lists and reviews, and they are really good about including self-published or small publishers books, as well as books by the big publishers, because the big publishers have such a dominance, right, when it comes to getting your books out there, distribution, reviews, awards. Like, there's a lot that stops these other books from you knowing they exist. So one of my big missions is just trying to help people find out about these incredible books. So I would ask for you to take away, and thank you if you have reached this point and watching this video, these questions. How do you see stories coming to your school community that reflect this kind of grassroots community-based storytelling that really gets to the community and is locally sourced by and for, and telling stories in ways that maybe reflect the communities they're coming from? And can you support some of these children's book creators by bringing these books into your school libraries and classrooms? When you buy their books, you are supporting them. When you ask them if they can come to your school and do school visits, you are supporting them. And you are supporting your students because they're getting access to this beautiful, diverse array of stories that are not being curated by the gatekeepers. So these are, links at the end. Again, I'm going to put this on make it available. And so I hope, you have enjoyed this and learned some things, and please share it with other people. Please write to me and get in touch. I am happy to be in communication and conversation with community. So thank you again. And that's the end. Oh, now I have to stop recording.